Well, I think we're at a disadvantage to certain other leagues and countries in the fact that we are certainly behind further behind in terms of the curve of the virus, and I think Britain Britain's peak in terms of the virus came quite a bit later than Germany's, and you can certainly suggest that is down to Germany handling it better and us not handling it so well as a government or as a nation. But you're only asking me about the football, so I'll I won't digress too much there. So we are behind other countries, and that's why Germany was able to, the Bundesliga was able to restart on May the 16th, and the Premier League at the time we speak is still some way off. And I feel like if we were sort of felt to be 3 or 4 weeks behind those countries in terms of the peak, it feels like we're a lot further behind them in terms of trying to get back onto a football pitch, because it just seems to me that there are questions being asked constantly and issues being raised constantly about the health and safety of restarting, which those questions are all important, but also the integrity and the fairness of restarting. And I think some of those questions have been a little bit sort of opportunistic by some of the clubs who possibly see a way out of getting relegated. And I've been, I've written about that. I've written about sort of self-interest infiltrating this debate and acknowledging that the self-interest in restarting amongst the bigger clubs. But I think there's a wider collective interest in restarting, and I think there's a more narrow self-interest in terms of some of the concerns that have been raised about one thing or another. And I've been accused of being sort of big club bias for raising those issues and suggesting that there's self-interest on part of the smaller clubs. I think it's absolutely not big club bias. If it was, I feel like I constantly talk and bang on about the greed of the bigger clubs, and in England and in Europe in terms of trying to make it less of a level playing field. And I think we here in this instance we've seen perhaps a little bit more self-interest among the smaller clubs than the bigger clubs. But by being self-interested and trying to sort of reduce the threat of relegation or eliminate the threat of relegation, I think some of those smaller clubs have been guilty of ignoring the needs of those clubs further down the pyramid, both in terms of allowing promotion relegation and in terms of the financial imperative really to try and restart and get the Premier League up and running so that other leagues and other clubs and other divisions can potentially use that as a lifeline.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, do you feel, obviously because the Premier League relies so much on television, packages, with the vast amounts of money raised, not only in this country but overseas rights as well. If the money wasn't so great, do you feel the season would have been voided if the league wasn't so dependent on TV money? Do you feel the league would have been voided, maybe like the French league, for example?
Well, it's interesting that the French league made the decision that they did, but in fact they didn't make the decision. The government made that decision for them, and maybe the government felt that there's not really a great financial or economic imperative to resuming Ligue 1 in the way that there is in Germany with Bundesliga, in Spain with La Liga, etc. But I think people are saying, well, if it wasn't for Liverpool being near the top of the title, or if it wasn't for the money involved, they wouldn't resume. I think the one thing we can really say with some certainty, in my opinion, is that if we were 10 games into the season or 19 games into the season, I don't think we would be having the same conversation. I think it probably would have been. I think it would probably have been easier to suspend the season in those circumstances. But when you're 3/4 of the way through, then even overlooking the need commercially to fulfill those contracts and finish, and deliver those live games, there is really a duty and a need to to finish the season. You can't. I mean, I've heard people saying, "Well, let's forget about this season. Let's prioritise next season." I don't think you can do that, because what happens if you get the same issues arising then? You get the whole, you get delays, you get suspensions, etc. next season. To me, it makes no sense to prioritise next season when we've got a season that's 3/4 of the way through. You've got to play it to a finish, and that's so that teams can compete for league titles or promotions. Ideally, the FA Cup and Champions League and Europa League as well. Also, so that teams can fight to avoid relegation. I think we've seen in Holland there was no promotion relegation, and the teams who are like Cambuur, who were well clear in the second tier, have missed out as a result. In France, we've seen Amiens and Toulouse relegated on the basis of a points per game table. I don't think either of those situations is fair. I think you've got to play it till there's a conclusion. Obviously, if it's safe to do so. If it's never ever safe to do so again, then football comes to an end. But I also feel that if we don't finish this season, and if we don't fulfill certain contracts, even if it is behind closed doors, which I hate, and I think it's just nothing like the same, I think they've got to try and finish the season, and that is sensible. And obviously it's going to end up with certain clubs missing out on promotion. It's going to probably end up with certain clubs relegated as long as they don't put a block on that. But that's how every season ends and should end and must end. There has to be, if it was NFL or NBA, etc., where there's no promotion relegation, I think there would be a really good case for saying, well, let's not finish the season. But I think because the whole of the league structure in European football relies on promotion relegation, you have to play these. You have to play this season as much as you can. And if there are leagues, League One and League Two have been suspended, and if that has to happen, it's really unfortunate, because there are always clubs who will miss out. But I do feel that it's better to adhere to the model of teams go up, teams go down, than and try to do it as fairly as possible, rather than just putting a complete block on it or declaring the season null and void or whatever. Obviously, it's going to inconvenience some clubs, whatever the outcome, but that's football.